The silence was worse than any war cry. For young cowboy John Stone, it was the sound of his own death warrant being signed. It began with a simple act of humanity, giving his last woolen blanket to a dying Cheyenne girl he found shivering in a ravine. But that kindness was twisted into an insult. Now 700 warriors, a sea of grim faces and sharpened steel, have formed a perfect silent line outside his rickety barn. They don't scream. They don't charge. They just watch. Inside with only a terrified horse for company, John is about to learn that in the unforgiving West, a man's best intention can dig his own grave. What happens when a single good deed is misunderstood as the ultimate act of war? Stay with us. The wind across the high plains of Wyoming carried a language of its own, and John Stone was one of the few who bothered to learn it. It was a lonely dialect, spoken in the rustle of sagebrush and the mournful cry of a distant hawk. It was the only conversation he'd had for the better part of a month. His small homestead was a splinter of civilization, stuck in the thumb of a vast, indifferent wilderness. A small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own hands, a barn that leaned a little more to the east each year, and a corral holding his only companion, a buckskin gelding named Patches. John, or Jed, as he was known to the few people he ever saw, was not yet 20. But his eyes held the weary caution of a man twice his age. His face was a road map of sun and wind, with lines already forming around a mouth that rarely smiled. He'd come out here to escape ghosts, the ghost of a stern father in a cavalry uniform, and the ghost of the Civil War that had taken him. He wanted nothing more than to work his small plot of land, raise a few head of cattle, and be left alone. The world of men, with its politics and its hatreds, had left a bitter taste in his mouth. It was on a raw afternoon in late autumn, with the sky the color of a fresh bruise, that he found her. He was riding the fence line, checking for breaks before the first heavy snow. The wind bit at his ears, and he had his collar turned up high on his sheepskin coat. Patches snorted and shied his ears, twitching towards a shallow, rock-strewn arroyo. Jed pulled on the reins, his hand instinctively resting near the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. Trouble in these parts usually came on 4 legs or 2, and neither was welcome. He dismounted his boots, crunching on the gravelly soil. He moved with a quiet efficiency, a habit learned from years of solitude. And then he saw her. She was little more than a girl, perhaps 15 or 16 summers old. She lay curled on her side, half hidden by a scraggly juniper bush. She was Cheyenne, that much was clear, from the intricate beadwork on her doe-skin dress, now tattered and stained. Her black hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and her face, though beautiful in its fine-boned structure, was drawn and pale beneath her olive skin. A terrible shallow rattle came from her chest with every breath. It was the sound of lungs filling with fluid, a death rattle Jed had heard before in battlefield tents. His first instinct was pure, unadulterated caution. A lone Cheyenne girl this far from her people meant something was wrong. It could be a trap. It could mean a war party was near. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him to mount his horse and ride away to pretend he had seen nothing. He could be back in his cabin in 20 minutes, the fire stoked the memory already fading. He took a step back. Patches whinnied softly, nudging his shoulder as if to ask what the delay was. Jed looked at the girl again. Her eyes flickered open dark pools of feverish pain. They weren't filled with hate or fear, but a sort of weary resignation. She was dying, and she knew it. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and a tremor racked her small frame. She was freezing. The ghosts in Jed's mind stirred. The ghost of his mother, a gentle woman who taught him that compassion was a strength, not a weakness. And the ghost of his father, a man who saw the world in black and white, blue uniforms and savage hostiles. "You see one," his father's voice echoed in his memory. "You can bet there's 100 more you don't see. Don't ever turn your back." But this wasn't a warrior. This was a child, shivering her life away on the cold, hard ground. Jed's jaw tightened. He couldn't leave her. It wasn't in him. He slowly, deliberately unstrapped his bedroll from behind his saddle. Inside was his one luxury, a thick, heavy wool blanket. It was dark blue, with a simple yellow stripe at the edge. It had been his mother's. She had woven it herself, and it was the last physical thing he had of hers. It had kept him warm on 1,000 cold nights, a tangible link to a life before the solitude, before the ghosts. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine, the scent of home. He walked forward, his movements slow and non-threatening. The girl's eyes tracked him, a flicker of alarm in their depths. "Easy now," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I ain't gonna hurt you." He knelt beside her. The rattling in her chest was louder now. He gently, carefully unfolded the heavy wool blanket and draped it over her. He tucked it in around her shoulders and feet, trying to preserve what little warmth her body still held. For a moment, her eyes cleared slightly. She looked at the blanket, then at him. Her lips parted, but only a dry whisper of air escaped. Jed stood up. There was nothing more he could do. He couldn't bring her back to his cabin. If she died there, he'd have to answer for it. He couldn't ride for help. The nearest town, Redemption, was a full day's ride, and its citizens had little love for the Cheyenne. He had done what he could. He had given a dying girl a little warmth for her final journey. He mounted Patches, and without looking back, rode towards his homestead, the wind feeling colder than ever without his bedroll. He told himself it was just a blanket, but as he rode, he could feel its weight, its absence like a premonition. He had just tried to do a good thing. He had no way of knowing that he had just committed an act of unspeakable provocation. He had no idea that the simple, dark blue wool of his mother's blanket, with its single yellow stripe, was not a symbol of comfort, but a banner of massacre. The next morning, the world was born in silence. A heavy frost had silvered every blade of grass, and the air was so still and cold it felt solid in Jed's lungs. He'd slept poorly, haunted by the image of the girl's feverish eyes. He went about his chores with a mechanical slowness, his mind 1,000 miles away in that rocky arroyo. He fed Patches, milked his one scrawny cow, and chopped firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, the only sound breaking the crystalline quiet. It was Patches who alerted him first. The horse, usually calm as a mill pond, suddenly threw his head up, his nostrils flaring. He let out a sharp, nervous whinny and stared intently at the low ridge to the east. Jed froze, axe in hand. He followed the horse's gaze. At first he saw nothing, just the undulating line of the prairie against the pale morning sky. Then a single rider crested the ridge, and another, and another. They kept coming, pouring over the horizon, like a slow, dark flood. They were not a chaotic war party, not a band of raiders. They moved with a disciplined, inexorable purpose, fanning out as they approached their lines, precise and deliberate. Jed's blood ran cold. He dropped the axe and sprinted for the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs. He slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the thick iron bolt across. His hands trembled. He grabbed his Winchester rifle from its pegs on the wall, his fingers fumbling as he checked the load. Patches was panicking in his stall, kicking at the wood. "Easy, boy, easy," Jed whispered, though the words were meant more for himself. He scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft, the dry straw crackling under his boots. There was a small loading window at the front of the barn, a square of missing planks that offered a clear, terrifying view. He peered through the gap, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. There were hundreds of them, more than he could count. They had formed a perfect, silent semicircle around his cabin and barn, just beyond rifle range. They were a living wall of Cheyenne warriors, mounted on powerful war ponies. Sunlight glinted off the barrels of old muskets, the heads of lances, and the razor-sharp edges of tomahawks. Their faces were grim, stoic masks of implacable resolve. Many wore the eagle feathers of seasoned fighters. And they did nothing. They just sat on their horses watching, waiting. The sheer disciplined silence of them was more terrifying than any battle cry he had ever heard. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Why? Why here? He had kept to himself, never caused any trouble. He had no quarrel with the Cheyenne. And then a sickening realization washed over him. The girl. It had to be the girl. They must have found her. But why would that bring this? Did they think he had harmed her? Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, a cold, indifferent orb. The warriors remained motionless, a statue-like army of vengeance. The silence pressed in on Jed, suffocating him. Every creak of the old barn timbers sounded like a gunshot. He replayed the scene in the arroyo over and over. He had only tried to help. He'd given her his blanket, his mother's blanket. A movement drew his eye. Near the center of the line, one warrior dismounted. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. A magnificent, full-feathered war bonnet rested on his head, signifying his status as a great chief. He held something in his hands. He walked forward a few paces, stopped and held it up for Jed to see. It was the blanket, his mother's dark blue, yellow striped blanket. And in that moment, seeing it held in the hands of the war chief, Jed's confusion curdled into pure, unadulterated horror. Because now, with the full weight of what was happening bearing down on him, he finally remembered where he had seen a blanket like that before. It wasn't just his mother's design. It was a standard-issue blanket for the 7th U.S. Cavalry. His father, Sergeant Thomas Stone, had been with the 7th. He'd been a quartermaster in charge of supplies. When he'd left the army, he'd taken a few surplus items with him, including a bolt of the dark blue wool cloth. His wife, a skilled weaver, had turned that cloth into blankets for their home. But the Cheyenne would not know that. They would not know about a quartermaster's surplus or a wife's handiwork. They would only know one thing. They would know that exact shade of blue, that specific yellow stripe from the aftermath of the Washita River. They would have seen those blankets covering the frozen bodies of their women and their children after Custer's dawn attack. To them, that blanket was not a symbol of warmth. It was the shroud of a massacre. Jed felt the floor of the hayloft sway beneath him. He had not just given a dying girl a blanket. He, the son of a 7th Cavalry sergeant, had wrapped the daughter of a Cheyenne chief in the very symbol of her people's slaughter. It was not an act of kindness. It was a final mocking desecration, a taunt, an unimaginable insult delivered to a grieving father. The chief Kiia, whose name meant howling wolf, let the blanket fall to the ground as if it were poison. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation. There would be no mercy. John Stone was a dead man. The only question was when the silence would finally break. And as Jed stared at the sea of 700 warriors, he knew he was utterly, hopelessly alone. His one act of compassion had been twisted by a cruel fate into a declaration of war he could never hope to win. The news like a foul wind blew across the prairie and into the dusty streets of Redemption. It was carried by a trapper named Silas Greaves, a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. He had been checking his lines near the Blackfoot Creek when he saw the impossible sight, a veritable army of Cheyenne warriors laying siege to the old stone homestead. He hadn't waited around to see the outcome, whipping his mule into a frenzy and not stopping until he burst through the batwing doors of the Redemption saloon. "They're here," he gasped, wild-eyed and panting. "The Cheyenne, hundreds of 'em, got the Stone Boy, pinned down in his barn." A hush fell over the saloon. Cards stopped mid-deal. Glasses of whiskey froze halfway to lips. Redemption was a town built on a fragile peace, a peace maintained by the fact that the Cheyenne kept to their lands and the white settlers kept to theirs. This news was a lit match tossed into a powder keg. The most powerful man in that saloon, and arguably in the whole county, was a cattle baron named Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man whose presence filled a room. He was large, dressed in a fine, tailored coat, with a thick moustache and cold, calculating eyes. He owned the biggest ranch, the most cattle, and had the town sheriff, a man named Brody, tucked neatly in his pocket. Thorne's land bordered John Stone's small homestead, and he had made no secret of his desire to acquire the boy's property, to gain control of the water rights to Blackfoot Creek. He'd made Jed a few low offers, all of which the boy had quietly refused. Thorne slammed his whiskey glass down on the table. This was not a disaster. It was an opportunity. "Well," Sheriff Thorne's voice boomed, turning to the corner where Sheriff Brody was nursing a beer. "It seems we have an Indian problem. A problem that has conveniently presented itself on land I've been trying to secure for the good of this community." Sheriff Brody was a man perpetually caught in the middle. He was older with a weary slump to his shoulders, a man who just wanted to serve out his term and retire in peace. He wasn't a bad man, but he was a weak one, and he was terrified of Thorne. "Now, Marcus, let's not jump to conclusions," Brody said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "We don't know why they're there. Maybe the boy did something." "He did something all right," Thorne sneered. "He existed on a piece of land I want. And now he's brought the devil to our doorstep. Those savages will wipe him out, and then what? You think they'll just pack up and go home? No. They'll be blood-crazed. They'll come for us next. For our ranches, our homes, our women." Thorne knew how to play on the fears of the townsfolk. He was a master puppeteer of public opinion. Men started muttering, their faces growing hard. The initial shock was quickly turning into a potent cocktail of fear and anger. "We need to form a posse," one man shouted from the bar. "Yeah, ride out there and show 'em what's what," another added, emboldened. Brody stood up, holding his hands out. "Hold on now. A posse. That's an act of war. We start shooting, and we'll have a full-blown uprising on our hands. We need to be smart about this." "Smart." Thorne laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You call waiting for them to burn us out of our beds. Smart, Brody, I call it cowardice. Greaves. How many did you say I ain't lying, Mr. Thorne? It was like the whole tribe, 700-800, maybe more than I ever seen in one place. A collective gasp went through the room. This wasn't some small raiding party. This was the full strength of the Cheyenne Nation. You see, Sheriff Thorne pressed his voice, dripping with righteous fury. This isn't about one boy anymore. This is about our survival. We need to ride out there, not to save the boy, he's already dead, but to protect this town. We hit them hard, we hit them up fast, and we drive them back to whatever God-forsaken rock they crawled out from under. He was not interested in saving John. In fact, Jed's death was the perfect pretext. He could lead a posse of townsmen out to the homestead, defend the town by slaughtering the Cheyenne, and claim Jed's land in the chaos that followed. He would be hailed as a hero, the man who saved redemption, and he would get his water rights. It was a perfect, bloody plan. Sheriff Brody looked around at the faces in the room. He saw the fear in their eyes, the way it was being expertly stoked into hatred by Thorne. He knew what would happen. A mob of scared, angry ranchers and townsfolk full of whiskey and self-righteousness hiding out to face a disciplined force of 700 Cheyenne warriors. It wouldn't be a battle. It would be a massacre. And it wasn't clear who would be massacred. "I'm the law here," Brody said, his voice lacking the conviction he was aiming for. "And I say we wait. We send a rider to Fort Laramie for the army. Let them handle it." Thorne stepped right up to Brody, his sheer size intimidating. "The army is 2 days away, Sheriff. By then our town could be a pile of ashes. I'm not waiting, and by the looks of it, neither are these good men." He gestured around the room. "We're forming a militia, right here, right now, to defend our homes. You can either lead it, Sheriff, or you can step aside." The choice was clear. Lead the mob and try to exert some small measure of control, or be branded a coward and lose what little authority he had left. Brody's shoulders slumped in defeat. "All right, Thorne," he said, his voice heavy. "All right, deputize them. But we do this my way. We ride out there, we assess the situation. No one fires a shot unless I give the order." "Understood." Thorne smiled a predator's smile. "Of course, Sheriff. Whatever you say." But they both knew who was really in charge. As the men of redemption began gathering their rifles and horses, their fear twisted into a grim purpose by Marcus Thorne's ambition, John Stone remained trapped in his barn. He was completely unaware that he was no longer just a man waiting to die at the hands of the Cheyenne. He was now a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game, caught between the silent, grieving fury of a warrior nation and the greedy, violent ambition of the town he once considered his own. The fuse had been lit, and the town of redemption was riding out to meet the storm. Inside the barn, time had slowed to a thick, syrupy crawl. Every shadow that danced across the hay-dusted floorboards was a lurking warrior. Every gust of wind rattling the loose planks was the sound of an impending attack. John had moved from the hayloft window, knowing that a stray glint of sunlight off his rifle barrel could be the signal that ended his life. He was now on the ground floor, crouched behind a stack of grain sacks, peering through a small crack in the main doors. His initial terror had subsided, replaced by a bone-deep weariness and a profound, aching regret. He wasn't just regretting his own imminent death, but the catastrophic misunderstanding that had caused it. He thought of his mother, of how her simple, loving craft had been so horribly perverted by history. He thought of the girl, a pony. He didn't know her name, but he pictured her and wondered if she had died in the warmth of the blanket, or if it had been ripped from her, adding to her suffering. He was so lost in this fog of despair that he almost didn't notice the change. The silence outside had been absolute for so long that the introduction of a new sound, however small, was jarring. It was the sound of voices, low, guttural, and rhythmic. Not war cries, but a conversation. Jed pressed his eye closer to the crack. He could see the great war chief Kiia still mounted. But now another warrior was beside him, speaking earnestly. This warrior was younger, leaner, his face a mask of intense concentration. He was Taza the Porcupine, second in command of the Cheyenne War Council, and a pony's older brother. Jed couldn't understand the words, of course, but he could read the language of conflict. Taza was gesturing first towards the barn, then back towards their own lines. Kiia sat like a stone statue, his face unreadable, his grief a cold, hard shell around him. Taza spoke, his voice low, but carrying in the stillness. "Father, my heart bleeds with yours. A pony is with the Great Spirit." But my eyes saw what they saw. The man in there did not throw the blanket on her in mockery. He knelt. He tucked it around her as a mother would a child. I was hidden in the rocks above. I saw it all. His face held no hate. Kiia's voice was like rocks grinding together. "You saw a white man, a veho, desecrating your sister with the banner of our murderers. Your grief clouds your sight, my son." No, Taza's voice rose with a passion that bordered on insubordination. "It is your grief that builds a mountain where there is a stone. I saw him ride away." He looked back once. His face. It was the face of a man leaving a grave. He was helpless. He did what little he could. Another elder warrior spoke up. "The blanket, Kiia. It is the only truth we need. It is a message. The son of the long knives mocks our pain." "But what if it is not?" Taza insisted, his gaze sweeping over the silent army. "We are 700 warriors, come to kill one man in a wooden shack. Is this honor? Is this the Cheyenne way, to crush a mouse with the foot of a buffalo?" My sister was gentle. She would not want a river of blood to mark her passing, especially if it flows from a mistake. This was the crux of it, the seed of doubt that Taza was trying to plant in the mind of his grieving father. The Cheyenne were a proud people with a deep, complex code of honor. A battle against a worthy foe brought glory. An execution born of a misunderstanding brought only shame. As this tense debate unfolded, a new element entered the standoff. Dust, a cloud of it rising from the west from the direction of redemption. A scout on the ridge let out a sharp cry. Every warrior's head turned. They saw it too. A large group of riders, at least 50 or 60, armed and moving fast. Jed saw them from his crack in the door. His heart, which he thought couldn't sink any lower, plummeted. The town. They weren't coming to help. He could see the sun glinting off their rifles. He could see the determined set of their jaws, even from this distance. They were a lynch mob. Marcus Thorne, he was sure, would be at their head. This changed the entire dynamic. The Cheyenne warriors who had been focused on Jed now saw a new threat approaching. Their silent, disciplined lines shifted. Lances were raised. Bows were drawn. They were no longer a jury waiting to deliver a verdict. They were an army preparing for battle. Sheriff Brody, riding at the head of the posse alongside Thorne, saw the Cheyenne lines shift to face them. He felt a cold dread wash over him. "Thorne, this is a mistake," he said, his voice tight. "Look at them. They're ready for us. We need to pull back." "Pull back," Thorne spat, "and show them our bellies." "No. We ride in hard. We show them we're not afraid. They're savages, Brody. They only respect strength." Inside the barn, John understood his situation with a terrifying new clarity. He was no longer a man facing one enemy, but a man trapped between two. He was the piece of flint caught between the hammer of the Cheyenne and the anvil of the posse. The open prairie around his homestead was about to become a killing field, and his barn was ground zero. He looked at his Winchester. He had maybe 20 rounds. It was useless against the Cheyenne, and he had no desire to use it against the men from the town, even if they were being led by fools. His death was certain now, one way or another. He would be killed by a Cheyenne arrow or a bullet from Thorne's posse. His name used as an excuse for a bloody battle that would stain this land for generations. A strange calm settled over him. If he was going to die, he would not die cowering in a barn. He would not be the reason for this war. He laid his rifle down. He took a deep breath, and he began to walk towards the heavy, bolted door. He was going to face them, all of them, unarmed. It was the only move he had left, a final desperate act in a drama he had never intended to write. With a groan of protesting wood, John lifted the heavy iron bolt from the barn door. The sound was unnaturally loud in the tense silence, a punctuation mark at the end of his life. He pulled one of the massive doors inward, just enough to slip through, then closed it behind him, shutting away the terrified whinnies of his horse, his last link to his simple life. He stood for a moment, blinking in the harsh sunlight. The world was a panorama of imminent violence. To his east, the vast, silent sea of Cheyenne warriors, their attention now divided between him and the newcomers. To his west, the posse from Redemption, a ragged line of 50 men, now halted, their own uncertainty palpable. And in the middle was him, a lone figure in a dusty shirt and worn jeans, unarmed, his hands held loosely at his sides. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything but this. But he held his ground. He was done running from ghosts. He fixed his eyes on the war chief, Kiia. He ignored the posse behind him completely. They were a problem for another world, not this one. His fate lay with the man in the eagle feather bonnet. He took one step, then another. He began to walk slowly and deliberately across the open ground that separated the barn from the Cheyenne line. It was the longest walk of his life. Every blade of grass, every small rock on the ground seemed to stand out in sharp relief. He could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, tracking his every move. The air was thick with a tension so profound it was almost physical. He expected an arrow in his back at any second, a bullet from the posse who might mistake his actions. But nothing came. His slow, deliberate, unarmed advance was so unexpected that it created a pocket of pure suspense. No one knew what to do. Sheriff Brody, watching through his spyglass, felt a knot in his stomach. "What in God's name is that boy doing?" he whispered. "He's committing suicide." Thorne sneered, though even he sounded a little shaken by the raw courage of the act. "Saves us the trouble." Jed kept walking. 20 yards, 30 yards. He could now make out the individual faces of the warriors in the front line. He saw their confusion, the tightening of their grips on their weapons. He saw the cold, unyielding grief in Kiia's eyes. But he also saw Taza Aponi's brother, whose expression was one of intense, conflicted turmoil. He stopped about 15 paces from the chief, close enough for his voice to be heard, but far enough to respect the line. He held his empty hands out, palms up, the universal sign of peace. He didn't know their language, and they didn't know his. Words were useless here. He had to speak a language they would all understand, the language of truth and grief. He looked directly at Kia man to man, father to father. Though he was not a father, he thought of his own. He slowly raised one hand and pointed to his own chest. "John Stone," he said, his voice clear and steady. Then he pointed to the ground, to the blue and yellow blanket lying in the dirt. "My mother, woven from the cloth of my father." He then made a gesture mimicking the uniform of a soldier, a blue coat. "My father, Sergeant Thomas Stone, 7th Cavalry." A ripple of understanding and renewed anger went through the Cheyenne line. He was admitting it. He was the son of a long knife. But Jed wasn't finished. He looked Kia in the eye, and his expression softened. The hardness left his face replaced by a profound and genuine sorrow. He pointed towards the east, towards the direction of the arroyo, where he had found the girl. He made a motion of shivering of someone small and sick. He then mimicked the act of taking off a coat and wrapping it around someone. The gesture was simple, paternal, protective. He then looked at Kia, and for the first time his own eyes welled with tears, not of fear, but of empathy. He touched his own chest again. He didn't have the words, but his face said everything. "I am sorry. I am sorry for your loss. I am sorry for the history that stands between us. I only saw a child who was cold. I meant no disrespect. It was a breathtaking gamble, a pantomime of truth on the edge of a grave." Kia stared at him, his face a granite mask. But something flickered in his eyes. Doubt. Taza had said the man showed kindness. The man's actions now, walking out to face certain death unarmed, speaking a truth that condemned him as the son of an enemy, yet showing a sorrow that seemed genuine. It did not align with the actions of a mocking coward. From the posse's line, Thorne grew impatient. "This is ridiculous. He's palavering with them." "Brody, are we going to sit here all day? Let's end this." He raised his rifle, aiming not at the Cheyenne, but at Jed. Killing Jed now would be the spark. It would look like the Cheyenne had killed him, and the battle would begin. But Sheriff Brody, in a moment of clarity and courage that would define the rest of his life, spurred his horse forward, knocking Thorne's rifle barrel towards the sky. The gun went off with a deafening crack, firing harmlessly into the air. "No!" Brody roared, his voice booming with an authority no one in Redemption had ever heard from him. "You will stand down, Thorne. This is not your fight anymore." The gunshot shattered the spell. The Cheyenne warriors, startled, raised their weapons. It was the moment of truth. The battle was about to begin. But Kia raised his hand, a single powerful gesture. "Hahe ena heso." Wait, stop. He looked from the smoking rifle of the white men to the terrified but resolute face of John Stone, and then down at the blanket. He was a chief, a leader, but he was also a father who had just lost his daughter. What Taza said, what this boy's actions showed, it warred with the poison of his grief and the history of his people's suffering. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant, directed at Jed, though he knew the boy wouldn't understand the words. "You are the son of my enemy," he said in Cheyenne. "You covered my daughter in the cloth of our sorrow. An honorable man would die for this insult." He paused, his eyes boring into Jed's. "A brave man would walk out to claim his death. You have done this. But words and gestures are wind. They cannot bring back my child. They cannot undig the graves of the Washita. He dismounted from his horse. The entire prairie seemed to hold its breath. He walked towards John, his steps heavy. He stopped just feet from him. "I will know your heart," Kiia said. "If you came in peace and sorrow, you will prove it. My daughter is gone. My people have nothing. We are being driven from our lands by men like those." He gestured with his chin towards the posse. "Give me a reason why my warriors should not wash this ground with the blood of every white man, here starting with you." John Stone stood before the grieving chief, his life hanging on a thread, the fate of everyone on that field resting on his next action. He had no weapon, no words, no power. All he had was the simple, unvarnished truth of his heart, and he had to find a way to make it understood. The world had shrunk to the space between two men. John stood before the towering war chief, the smell of leather and wood smoke and righteous anger rolling off him in waves. Kiia had asked for a reason. Not an excuse, not a plea, but a reason. Jed's mind, cleared by the certainty of his own death, worked with a desperate clarity. He could not offer land. It was not his to give. He could not offer money. He had none. He could not offer justice for the past. He was just one man. What could he offer a chief who had lost a daughter and was losing his world? He looked past Kiia for a moment at the hundreds of grim-faced warriors. He saw hungry faces, worn clothing, ancient rifles. They were a proud people, but they were a people on the brink. Then he looked back at the posse from Redemption. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw the arrogance of men like Thorne, men who believed the world was theirs for the taking. John knew what he had to give. The only thing he truly owned, his future. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his back on Kiia. It was an act of supreme trust, or supreme foolishness. He faced the direction of his own cabin, his own barn. He took one step, then another, walking away from the Cheyenne. Taza let out an involuntary gasp. The warriors tensed. Had the boy lost his mind? To turn your back on an enemy was to invite a lance. But Jed did not walk towards the safety of the barn. He walked past it. He walked towards the wooden posts of his corral. He stopped at the gate, unlatched it, and swung it wide open. He turned back to face Kiia. He pointed at his homestead, the small, sturdy cabin he had built with his own hands, the barn leaning but full of hay, the fenced-in pasture, the well with its fresh, sweet water. He pointed to the scrawny milk cow that was now wandering out of the open corral. He pointed to the sky, to the land, to everything. Then he pointed back at Kiia and his people. He was giving it to them. All of it. It was a gesture so profound, so absolute, that it transcended language. He wasn't just offering a gift. He was surrendering his entire existence in this place. It was an act of complete and total sacrifice. It was not an apology for the blanket. It was reparations. It was his answer to Kiia's question. You ask me for a reason. This is my reason. Take it. Take my home. Take my future. Let there be no more death here today. From the posse's line, Marcus Thorne watched in disbelief, his face turning purple with rage. What is he doing? That's my water. That's my land. He's giving it to them. Sheriff Brody watched his mouth agape. He was witnessing something he had never seen before. Not a battle, not a surrender, but a kind of peace being forged in the most unlikely way imaginable. Kiia stared at John. The boy had offered up his entire world. The home he had built, the land he had worked. It was a gesture of such magnitude that it finally definitively broke through the chief's armor of grief. This was not the act of a mocking enemy. This was the act of a man with a true heart, a man willing to pay any price to undo the pain he had inadvertently caused. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped Kiia's lips. The hard lines of his face softened, and for the first time the cold fury in his eyes was replaced by a deep, fathomless sorrow. He looked at Jed, and he saw not the son of a soldier, but another man caught in the gears of a hateful world. He turned to his son, Taza. He spoke in Cheyenne, his voice thick with emotion. "My son, your eyes were true. My grief made me blind." He then turned back to John and gave a single sharp nod. It was not a gesture of friendship. It was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. It was acceptance. The debt in his eyes had been paid. Kiia raised his hand again, and this time he gave a series of sharp commands. The Cheyenne warriors, their faces a mixture of confusion, awe, and relief, began to pull back. The great terrifying wall of men turned their ponies, and with the same discipline with which they had arrived, began to ride away. They did not touch the cabin. They did not take the cow. The offer was enough. The honor had been satisfied. As they retreated over the ridge, one warrior broke from the line. It was Taza. He rode up to where John stood, his body trembling with the adrenaline of the last hour. Taza stopped his horse and looked down at Jed. He didn't smile, but the animosity was gone from his eyes. He reached into a pouch at his side and pulled out a single beautifully crafted eagle feather, its tip dyed red. He leaned down and held it out to Jed. "For a brave man," Taza said in broken, heavily accented English. "My sister. She would have seen your heart." John, his hand trembling, took the feather. He could only nod his throat, too tight for words. Taza wheeled his horse and galloped away to join his retreating people, leaving John Stone standing alone in the middle of the prairie. The eagle feather in one hand, the owner of a homestead he had just given away. He had walked out to die. Instead, he had found a strange, brutal, and beautiful form of peace. But as he watched the last of the warriors disappear over the horizon, he turned to see the posse from Redemption riding towards him, and he knew that while one war had been averted, another was just beginning. The posse from Redemption rode up not with relief, but with a simmering fury. Marcus Thorne was at the forefront, his face a thundercloud. He slid from his horse and stormed towards Jed, his hand gripping the bullwhip coiled at his side. "You foolish, sentimental boy," Thorne bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You gave them your land, my water. You've emboldened them. You've shown them that all they have to do is threaten us. And we'll hand over everything we own." Jed stood his ground, exhausted, but resolute. He looked Thorne squarely in the eye. "I showed them that not every white man is a thief. I showed them that a life is worth more than a piece of dirt. 700 warriors are riding away in peace, Thorne. How many of us would be dead if your plan had worked? Sheriff Brody dismounted and stepped between them. That's enough, Marcus. The boy just saved every one of our lives. He did what no army could have done. He ended it. Ended it." Thorne laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "He's just begun something. The word will spread. This land is now tainted. No one will want it. He's made us look weak." The other men of the posse muttered their initial relief, now being poisoned by Thorne's rhetoric. They looked at Jed not as a hero, but as an outcast, someone who had sided with the enemy, who had broken the unspoken rules of their world. "You're finished in this county," Stone Thorne spat, pointing a finger at Jed's face. "You're no better than them. You best pack your things and ride on. No one will trade with you. No one will speak to you. You're on your own." Thorne and his men mounted up and rode back towards redemption, leaving Jed and Sheriff Brody alone in the vast emptiness. Brody sighed, looking at the young man before him. "He's right, you know. Not about you being wrong, but about how they'll see it. This town, it doesn't have room for a man like you. You're too decent for it." Jed looked at his cabin, his barn. It was still his, physically. The Cheyenne had refused the gift, but it wasn't his home anymore. The ghosts he had tried to escape had found him, and in confronting them he had been exiled from the world of men he had tried so hard to avoid. "Where will you go?" Brody asked. Jed looked down at the eagle feather in his hand. He then looked towards the distant mountains, where the Cheyenne had disappeared. He didn't belong with them. He no longer belonged here. He was a man caught between two worlds belonging to neither. "I don't know," Jed said, his voice quiet. "Somewhere the wind doesn't carry the sound of men's hate." He went into his barn, saddled Patches, and gathered the few possessions he had. He didn't take the blanket. He left it folded neatly on his cot, a relic of a life that was over. As he rode out, he didn't look back. There was nothing left for him to see. John Stone rode west, a solitary figure against the setting sun. He was no longer just a young cowboy. He was a man who had faced down an army with nothing but the truth. He had lost his home, his community, and his place in the world. But as he rode into the unknown with an eagle feather tucked safely in his shirt and the silence of the high plains as his only companion, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had learned the terrible price of misunderstanding and the immeasurable value of a single, courageous act of grace. He was alone, but for the first time in his life, he was truly free. The story of John Stone isn't just a tale of the Old West. It's a powerful, timeless reminder of how quickly misunderstanding can escalate into violence, and how one person's courage can change the course of history, even if only for a single day on a lonely stretch of prairie. It shows us that true strength isn't found in the power of a gun, but in the willingness to face down hatred with an open, honest heart. John lost his home, but he found his honor and saved countless lives from the poison of revenge. If this story of incredible courage and profound consequence moved you, please help us share more tales from the unforgiving West by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates real-life drama and complex heroes. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for listening.